just want to say that whatever your perspective, there are some intuitive understandings about the value of grade separations. So if you're a planner or a policymaker, you understand the frustration of a busy at-grade crossing that experiences a lot of congestion and the impacts that creates on the transportation network on both sides of the tracks. And if you're a member of the community, you're frustrated. You're a commuter waiting at a crossing. You're recognizing that with all that traffic congestion waiting at the crossing, there's increased congestion and emissions. And if you're a railroader and there's an incident at that crossing, well, now your whole rail network has come to a stop, whether you're moving passengers or freight. My perspective comes from working for a member of Congress that Bruce and I both worked for a long time ago in Washington State, John Miller, working for the U.S. Department of Transportation, working for Gary Locke when he was governor as his transportation advisor, and then joining the railroad. And so through all those experiences, I kind of tried to pull together a sense of perspective. And the railroader's perspective is, as we look at this from the sense of sustainability and longevity, railroaders doing what we do, historically people recognize and remember the value that railroads brought to a community, the best jobs in town and moving commerce and all of those things and people. And sometimes today we see that attitude is replaced by frustration. Why is this train, keeping me from getting to the other side of the tracks? So social license becomes something that is fundamental to the future sustainability of rail operations in proximity with communities growing ever closer to active rail lines. Land use conflicts are something that we have to deal with, and grade separations, again, are the beautiful solution, not just a Band-Aid, but the solution to solving that problem. So socializing that concept of a robust federal program, I started conversations with the leadership of NACO, the National Association of Counties, former presidents, current president. It really gelled, and there was a lot of support behind it. And everybody, myself included, said, you know what, Jim Healy is the person who can carry the football down the field, be the quarterback, be the leader of this effort. Jim chaired the transportation committee of NACO. He has been a great partner with the Association of American Railroads, the railroad industry, and the counties coming together to solve problems and to work together. And he really, through his leadership with NACO, his experience from DuPage County, a suburb of Chicago where all things rail happen, and also his leadership on the executive committee of the National Association of Regional Councils. So there you get a great combination. He has really taken this ball and run with it. I don't want to steal his thunder, but he championed a unanimous vote at NACO, embracing and endorsing the idea of a robust federal grade separation program. And with that, I surrender my microphone to Bruce and to Jim and everyone else. And I just want to thank, again, PNWER for bringing this together.
Jim.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm hoping you can hear me. Can you say yes or no? All
Yes.
right. My microphone is working. Senator, everybody on the call, thank you all for being here. There's always some background NACO likes to give when we're talking about counties and their relationship to roads and bridges and highways and stuff. 45% of the public roads are actually owned by counties, whereas only 32% are owned by cities, 19% by states, and 3% by the federal government. 40% of the national bridge inventory is owned by counties and maintained by counties. And we directly support roughly 78% of the public transit systems and 34% of our national public airports. Counties invest $134 billion annually across the country in construction of infrastructure and its maintenance. What you mentioned earlier, that I got a unanimous vote out of the NACO committee, it actually was, I found, fairly easy when talking about railroads. I mean, Andrew and I go back now almost 20 years when, as Ray LaHood once told me, he goes, municipalities and counties always referred to railroads as those blanking railroads. Now we just refer to them as people we work with and are people we hope to continue to work with as we go into the future. The nation's rail network all flows through the country's 3,000 counties. All counties face a unique challenge, and our rural counties actually have an even harder time, as a large percentage, almost 80% of those crossings for into rural areas don't even have signs or tracks of any kind, or gates of any kind. Rail safety is obviously critical to NACO. It is something we've talked about for many, many years, and the challenges are there for us going into the future. And we have a good idea for how to fix it. It's just getting the people behind us to really push forward. What people don't understand is the impact that a grade separation or lack thereof has on a urbanized area or even a suburban area. And the rail networks around Chicago pass through all those corridors. We have the inner city of Chicago. We have the close-in, the rest of Cook County. We then have the urban areas, the suburban areas, which is my county of 1 million people, which is west of the city. Then we have the rural areas, and then the extremely rural areas going further west. And it affects all of us. And as you get closer to the center of the city, it affects us more and more. And the problems and the challenges are amplified. The emergency response is a big problem for our areas. Many times there are many cities in the urbanized ring around Chicago, and even in the suburban ring where I'm from, that can't get their first responders from one side of the tracks to the other to the hospital, which is a major problem for police, fire, and ambulance services. We have traffic congestion because of the grade crossings. That is something that is obvious to everybody, that when a train comes through, the best we can do is back up the traffic into the roadway, which then of course causes additional problems on the rest of our infrastructure. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year, $150 billion every year to improve our roadways, but yet when we come to the railroad tracks, we're stuck. And without that added dollars to be put into the infrastructure to put the grade separations, pretty much what you've put in before it and after it on either side of the tracks is at total, it is at the mercy of the railroads itself as they go through. So what's the other problems that cause from this? Consumption of oil, consumption of gas, pollution. The amount of pollution that comes off of a half a mile to a mile's worth of cars in each direction of a railroad crossing is just pumping out exhaust into the system. So I've always said that there is something for everybody on each side of the aisle to love regarding putting in grade separations. Our problem is we just haven't had anybody who has had the foresight to put in the dollar amounts that is needed. There are programs out there to put in rail grade separations, but the amount of money that's necessary is just not there. A grade separation in a rural area is going to cost you, in a far rural area, is going to cost you 20 million, 25 million. As you get into the suburban area, right next to my area, it's going to cost you 30 to 35. As you get into my area, it's going to cost you 40. The cheapest you're going to get away that I've built is 28 million for a grade separation, all the way in up to 50, 60 million for a grade separation. And as you get into the urbanized areas of Chicago, grade separations are going to cost you 100 million a piece or more. The amount of money that's currently set aside for that is woefully underfunded. You really cannot do anything. You are begging, you are pulling every dime you can put together to try and make it happen, because you know the benefits are there if we are just able to build those grade separation. The ability to maximize our system is there. All we have to do is spend the money to do it. The idea came forward after discussions with Andrew that we need to stop this piecemeal pace of building sorely needed grade separations. Even the CREATE system that is put in Chicago is fantastic, but it's only going to handle what we're doing today. it's not going to handle the future, and the future is freight rail, taking it from the coasts and bringing it in, taking it from the rural areas where the crops are grown and things of that nature into the urbanized area. Without the increase of grade separations, we're just going to get further and further behind, even though we have spent an enormous amount of money on CREATE. The real solution is something we've talked about for many years, and actually puts a smile on the face of both railroads and locally elected officials. There's nothing an elected official loves more than seeing a grade separation. And I can attest to it, as in I've been lucky enough in my area that because of the CN's purchase of the EJ&E Railroad, we were able to get some grade separations put in. And we're actually putting in another one now that the county's been waiting in line for about 15 years to get enough money together through CMAP, which is our MPO. So I know that you put a smile on my face the moment you talk about grade separations, and that is across the country. But we just don't seem to have the impetus to do it. Now, I understand, and I've just read something from Chairman DeFazio, who has put together something with rail safety. Here it is right here. The only problem is he's missing a zero. He's talking about 2.5 billion over 5 years, and quite frankly, something that we've talked about is 25 billion over 5 years, 5 billion a year for 5 years. After 4 years, we can really take an in-depth look at how we've affected the system. And I think after that 4th year, you will see the advantages that we've been able to do by getting these, first of all, in terms of running the freight from one side of the country to the other, not having to stop and visit the Sears Tower in Chicago, but actually being able to go straight through and be able to deliver your product on time and in a reasonable manner. But also you'd be able to keep cars rolling, you'd reduce congestion, you reduce pollution, you'd be able to have our first responders get there. But it's going to take a lot more than what's there now. What Chairman DeFazio has put down is 2.5 billion over the 5 years. Wonderful start, but I think you just need to add a zero in there and make it 25 billion over the 5 years, and then allow us to sit there and work with the railroads and the MPOs and the state itself to determine which corridors we're going to clean up, with those dollars and those appointments. Organizations like the National Association of Counties is really primed to help on this as much as we possibly can, and we will do whatever is necessary to get this out to everybody out there. We will work with whoever is necessary. I know that the other groups out there that I've been talking with, except for this COVID and then the other things that have come forward, we're still looking to continue forward. In fact, to show you how much this means to government agencies and local governments across the country, I am actually retiring on December 1st. After 25 years, it's enough being a county commissioner. I've loved it, but it's enough. But they've asked me to stay on to continue pushing this ball forward from both the Chicago metropolitan region, the MPO and the Cook and the Collier County Caucus, also the state of Illinois, and also NACO. So I'm going to continue to work forward on this issue even after I've retired, because it is so important to do so. My dad was part of the Kennedy administration, and before that, the Eisenhower administration. He was a civil servant working in transportation, and he dealt a lot with the trains and the rail. And I think that he's looking up, looking down on me now, saying, now you understand. Now you understand. You have to move this stuff quickly, which is something he always talked about. I need to get it from point A to point B. During World War II, that's what he did. He moved everything from one part of the country to the other, get it on ships, send it overseas. We need that capability. We need to improve our system for not only our own personal reasons for moving our first responders and not having to sit for our lifetime behind a railgate, but also for our national defense and for the betterment of this country as a whole. So I'm happy as we go forward. I think I've talked my entire time, so I'm going to turn it over to the next person in line. But to say that NACO is there, we passed resolutions. We're getting that resolution over to the League of Cities, Conference of Mayors, and to all the rest of the groups, so we can have a combined effort moving forward in the next 10 months to a year. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate your passion and your leadership on this. Paul from BNSF, you're up.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, thank you so much to PNWER and Bruce, Jim, for your comments. Andrew Johnson, it's great to see you. And Senator Windsor, Representative Larson, for having us here today. BNSF is proud to be a part of the Pacific Northwest community, and certainly you all know how important that part of the country is to our network and to our nation's system of trade. I'm guessing my slides are up at this point?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, great. So the first one is just really a quick view of our network for those that may not be familiar, but BNSF is a fully owned subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway, over 40,000 employees, and we operate a network of more than 32,000 route miles. And we're also proud of the fact that we lead the industry in technological innovation. And one of the other places that we feel like we lead the industry is in this concept around cooperative engagement with our communities over not just policy, but how do we affect practical solutions. So if we go to the next slide, what's maybe unique about our approach to this conversation is that we see it first and foremost as a safety opportunity. And while the communities might see rightly first and foremost the need for mobility, we're looking at it from a grade crossing safety perspective. And that's because we've got more than 25,000 crossings in our network, and we're proud that we have the lowest rate of incidents at grade crossings across our network amongst the US Class 1 railroads. And so my team, the public projects team, is really responsible for BNSF's engagement with the public agency, whoever it might be, at every one of those grade crossings. And that's everything from the installation of signal equipment, the maintenance of crossing surfaces, to all those other things you see here. And so we're proud to be on the forefront of this conversation, and really the opportunity to engage with public partners in this discussion around corridor planning and separating trains from vehicles for not just the safety benefits, but also the community impact benefits is something that we're really excited to do. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about what that safety picture looks like. And so the Section 130 program has been very successful since its inception at lowering the overall incidence of grade crossing accidents across the country. But we see what the rest of the industry and the FRA sees, that the efficacy of the program perhaps is starting to flatten out, because these quotes from the GAO and the FRA tell the story. Driver behavior is the main cause of highway rail grade crossing crashes, and nearly half of all collisions at a grade crossing happens at places where there are already lights and gates. So that tells us that while the expedient answer for communities and states might be just the continued installation of lights and gates where they don't exist today, these results would tell you that maybe isn't the full answer, and that's where the grade separation conversation comes in. You can also see that we've been really effective working with our community partners to close grade crossings over the last 20 years or so. More than 6,500 crossings have been closed in partnership with communities where BNSF and that community said, you know, the right thing to do is consolidate traffic to a different location and just eliminate this exposure. And so let's talk a little bit about how we plan with communities, how we engage with communities to develop these projects, recognizing all the things that Jim said are true, that these are expensive projects, they take a long time to get the partners together, and the funding is scarce. So we like to be able to sit down across the table from our community partners and understand what are their needs over a specific corridor as we talk about what our needs are, and how can we effectively grow together. And it's from those sorts of conversations that long-range plans can result, because frankly, you all know that in the public space, you don't get to achieve a 10, 50, $100 million infrastructure project without lots of planning and lots of conversation to align those interests from the state to the local to the federal level. And so BNSF is happy to engage in those conversations to develop projects of mutual benefit, where both BNSF and the public partners make investment in those types of projects commensurate with the benefits that we achieve. And we engage in that primarily through federal discretionary grant programs, but we also appreciate when appropriations can be had, because the state legislature may pick up where a local authority may be able to fund the opportunity, their portion of the opportunity that's in front of us. And the place that we get to leverage an advantage, I think, is that we can work across, and we like to work across political boundaries and jurisdictional boundaries to be able to bridge gaps that can exist sometimes in the different levels of public administrations to bring everybody to the table, and we're happy to do that. So one example of such an opportunity is on the last slide. The Great Northern Corridor Coalition is really an opportunity for us to do that. So here you have a coalition of 8 states stretching from Jim's backyard in Chicago all the way to where this audience is right now in the Pacific Northwest. And the vision for this coalition is to speak with a unified voice about multimodal, not just railroad, but railroad, highway, port, multimodal transportation investment that will enhance velocity and efficiency of the multimodal freight mobility network. And so this group has been together for a number of years and is really coalescing around the idea of creating this program of projects and then being able to effectively tell that story in the state houses along the corridor, and then also in Washington, D.C. to hopefully become a beneficiary of some of the opportunities that are being discussed here today. And so at the end of the day, again, BNSF is very proud to be a part of this coalition, the Great Northern Corridor Coalition, and to work with our community partners to find ways to develop, have a long-term view to develop infrastructure solutions that are going to make a generational difference for not just us, but the communities that we serve. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to make these comments, and we appreciate the chance to speak with you today.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And over the last 3 years, we've had several briefings in Idaho and Montana and in Puget Sound about the Great Northern Corridor. And we hope this Great Separation program would go through because it gives a great opportunity. We think the states along the corridor would compete well under a federal discretionary program for Great Separation. So we appreciate BNSF's leadership. We're going to go across the border now to Vancouver and Fraser Harbor, where, as I referenced earlier, they've done a remarkable job of developing great separation projects, starting with the Asia Pacific Gateway and looking forward to the future. So I'm going to turn it over to Devin Fitch, who is the Director of Infrastructure Delivery for the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. Devin?
Thank you, Bruce. Morning, everyone. Pleasure to have the time. Can we advance to the next slide, please? So I said I'm the Director of Infrastructure Delivery with the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, and we'll have a pretty brief presentation on some successes that we've had in the past and some projects that we have on deck right now related to grade separations. You could advance the slide, please. Yeah, I will start with a brief summary on the port and the Port Authority for those that aren't familiar, and then we'll lead into some past precedents and future opportunities. Next slide. So very quickly, our mission statement is to enable Canada's trade objectives, ensuring safety, environmental protection, and consideration for local communities. And the point that I wanted to highlight on this slide is the embedment of that consideration for communities right in our mission statement. And so right from the get-go, we're set up to consider a collaborative and balanced approach with respect to both our national objectives, but also our local and regional objectives at the same time. Next slide, please. In terms of the Port Authority itself, unlike some American ports, we are an independent organization. We're an arm's length federal agency. We don't receive any tax dollars. We're completely self-sufficient, and our revenue streams are really related to user fees for those that are operating in the port, and also the lease of federally owned lands to private terminal operators. And of course, we do a lot of work in the environmental sphere and around port safety. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that from a geographic perspective, this is showing sort of the lands that we own and the waters that we sort of operate. We border on 16 discrete independent municipalities and 1 Treaty First Nation, and so we operate in a fairly complex jurisdictional environment, and our ability to sort of deliver projects is heavily dependent on our ability to develop and maintain successful relationships with those adjacent municipalities and of course Indigenous groups that have traditional rights and interests in this area. Next slide, please. So in terms of the success that we've had to date, we've invested about $7.5 billion in what we call the Gateway from 2009 to 2015. A lot of that was related to grade separations along the major trade corridors, the supply chain network of road and rail, infrastructure that accesses our port lands. Sort of shown here are some grade separations on our Roberts Bank rail corridor, some grade separations in the what we call the North Shore trade area, and the South Shore trade area, and those were really a collaborative development and delivery of those projects where, given the jurisdictional questions, we had to have collaboration between rail authorities, the Port Authority, a local municipality, and then several federal level and provincial level regulatory agencies. Next slide, please. So combined with that sort of investment in what we call the common use infrastructure around road and rail, we did have a lot of private sector investment into the terminal facilities themselves. And so we really see that as a showcase of the type of success and incentivization of private sector investment into facilities that benefit local region, and also the nation. They really see that a strong, resilient, reliable supply chain network allows them to make their financially prudent decisions to further invest in capacity on those port terminals to the benefit of everyone, really. Next slide, please. A couple other examples of some big private sector investments that are happening right now. We have a G3 terminal. It's a $500 million grain terminal expansion happening in the North Shore of Burrard Inlet. And then we have a container terminal expansion happening, again, another $500 million project on the South Shore of Burrard Inlet, due in large part because of the sort of investments that we've made in the supply chain network to date, but also some investments that we're continuing to make as we move forward. Next slide, please. So looking forward, we've developed a roadmap. Part of our success is that interagency, different level of government collaboration and cooperation. And so we've developed a strategy called the Greater Vancouver Gateway 2030 strategy, which is really a hit list of projects to address existing or potential future bottlenecks on our supply chain. And the vast majority, no surprise, are grade separations. And we see this document as being a key one to show the necessary sort of alignment of interests and support in a complex environment to allow us to confidently move forward with funding applications to the federal government. And it's a real showcase of successful collaboration. Next slide, please. So this is our map of the region that we operate in the Greater Vancouver area. The green dots are projects, mostly grade separations that have been done through the Asia Pacific Gateway Corridor Initiative. The blue dots are future projects that we're hoping to get funding for, and the red dots are projects that are currently funded and underway in the region. The funding split of this is typically, a rail authority, the Port Authority, and the federal government. And in some cases some municipal funding, but in most cases just a municipal acceptance and support to own and maintain the assets once built. Next slide, please. This slide is something that we use in our public consultation and engagement activities. I won't belabor the point. I think other presenters have spoken quite compellingly to the benefits of grade separation. Next slide, please. So coming to the close of the presentation, I've only got 2 slides left. This one is just an example of a, tale of woe, my job is hard type slide. This is one of the grade separations that we're moving forward in the region. And each of those boxes represents a government agency or an indigenous group. There's 9 on the slide. And if you count the Port Authority, there's essentially 10 different agencies that all need to approve and accept the proposal for it to move forward, and they move across the spectrum of local to sort of provincial to federal entities. So quite a complex environment. And then the last slide I'll close on is this one around sort of a recent win that we've had. We went out and did a public consultation on one of our grade separations, and I promise we didn't pay for this newspaper article. The headline speaks for itself. It's an insanely good idea. So if we can remove the roadblocks and not trip ourselves up, there's a lot of compelling rationale to get these projects moving forward to everyone's benefit. And that closes my presentation.
Wow, Devin, you win an award. How you got through all those slides in that amount of time is remarkable. And we'll have to bring you down here to teach a class on grade separation. You guys have done a great job up there, really, very impressive. Okay, now I have great pleasure in introducing my good friend, Representative Rick Larson from the 2nd Congressional District, I think the best district in Washington State, which includes portions of Snohomish, Skagit, Whatcom, and Olive Island and San Juan counties. Rick serves on the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee. You heard reference to the chair, Pete DeFazio from Oregon. And I believe he's still the chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, because I read about him in the paper talking about Boeing, airlines, and recovery. He also is an important member of the House Armed Services Committee. I'm very pleased to introduce Rick, who I've known since he was on the Snohomish County Council. Rick.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just do a sound check. Bruce, is that all right? Great.
We hear you loud and clear.
Okay, and I don't know if you can see me. I don't have any content to share on my screen. I just have some comments to provide.
Great.
So if you have my voice, that's right. I can't see what you see, so I'll just talk. Which, as a member of Congress, was unusual for me to just talk. But I do want to know, I really appreciate Paul's comments. Paul from BNSF, he did not let you know that the 25,200 grade separations that are in the BNSF network, 90% of those are in my district, or it would seem so from the phone calls. So but I will say the relationship here in my corner of the Northwest has been a good relationship with BNSF as well, and appreciate the responsiveness when we do get those kinds of phone calls. So, and for those who don't know this area, I do represent, the way I put it is north of Seattle, none of Seattle is the way to think of it geographically. And we have our own challenges here in our corner of the Northwest. And as Bruce noted, I'm also the chair of Aviation Subcommittee and spend quite a bit of time on that. And I think I'm number 4 or 5 in seniority on the House Transportation Committee as a whole. So all things transportation here in the Pacific Northwest, in our corner here north of Seattle. Before I begin, though, I want to briefly comment on the state of our country. I appreciate Chuck's comments at the beginning of the seminar. But I do think that the killing of George Floyd has, again, focused our attention and outrage on persistent systemic racism in the United States. So now more than ever, leaders' words and action do matter. And I've been on the phone several times with the group, with community leaders, elected officials, and even local law enforcement. And I have a few more calls today to gather ideas about what we can do to address this. I have my own set of ideas, but the Judiciary Committee in Congress is having a hearing next Wednesday, on racial injustice and law enforcement. And so kind of watch this space. I presume we'll be moving forward on legislation in the very near future. I want to then continue to get back to rail here, talk a little bit about the pandemic impact on rail. The pandemic has decimated U.S. rail ridership. It has shaken passenger confidence in all forms of transportation, and it's triggered layoffs throughout the industry. According to our own state's Department of Transportation, Amtrak ridership was down 95% last week, with just 97 passengers last Wednesday, compared to nearly 2,000 passengers on the same day last year. But I do want to acknowledge the critical work that rail crews and stakeholders are doing to ensure the health and safety of that traveling public. So Congress does need to continue to provide pandemic relief for rail transit to ensure the sustainability of that critical network. And I'll get to freight in a moment, but just in March, Congress, we passed the Bipartisan CARES Act for $526 million for the Amtrak National Network, and $239 million set aside to offset cost increases states would otherwise have had to cover, and another $250,000 just for FRA's safety and operations program to respond to the pandemic. We also voted to ensure railroad workers receive unemployment and health benefits. Now, most recently, we passed the HEROES Act, which now sits in the Senate, to improve travel and working conditions on U.S. railroads, including requiring the Amtrak employees and passengers aboard all trains wear protective face masks and that the availability of masks or protective face coverings, gloves, and such are available. And then finally, that Amtrak trains and stations and facilities are frequently cleaned. Now to the Invest in America Act and rail safety. Said for a long time that you can't have a big league economy with little league infrastructure. And in Washington State, in our state, that transportation investment means jobs. Robust federal investment in rail is critical to improving access to reliable transit options, reliable freight options, and to ensure safety. So yesterday, the House T&I Committee introduced the Invest in America Act, which is a 5-year, $500 billion surface transportation reauthorization bill. Under the bill, our own state would get nearly $7 billion in highway and transit funding to move towards economic recovery and improve safety, efficiency, and accessibility. The bill invests $60 billion in federal rail programs, including $7 billion for the FRA's Consolidated Rail Improvement or Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements grants, or the CRISI grants. In response to the Amtrak Cascades derailment near DuPont, the bill includes language directing the U.S. DOT to study how signage can improve rail safety, reevaluate seat securement mechanisms, and identify means to prevent their failure. It also establishes an annual reporting requirement for positive train control system failures. Regarding at-grade rail separations, maybe we should just call them at-grade and shorten it up, but at-grade rail separations, as the Pacific Northwest economy continues to grow, as we get into recovery and the economy grows and freight moves more frequently throughout the region, railways and roadways will become more congested. So local officials are obviously always telling me to improve at-grade crossings, as I noted. Rail incidents are more likely to happen at these crossings and frequently delay people. And Andrew discussed earlier the FAST corridor work that was done earlier. And as was noted, the Invest in America Act continues efforts by investing a full $2.5 billion to build and improve at-grade crossings. We'd always like to add more zeros to things, I assure you, but $2.5 billion to build and improve at-grade crossings and establish a $30 million grant program focused on reducing rail-related accidents. The bill also includes expands funding eligibility to include projects to mitigate lost access from crossing closure and strategies to prevent or reduce trespasser fatalities and injuries along railroad rights of way. So we've introduced this bill, or I think we're expecting a markup on the 17th of June in a couple weeks. And consistent with my vote against remote proxy voting, I will be live in person in DC when we do that markup in a couple of weeks. Just finally, I'll note that on the broader economic recovery, public health will lead the economic health recovery. And so in our state, we've got phase 2 reopenings happening in most counties. And we're still waiting on Snohomish, Skagit, and Whatcom for decisions there. But I think it's important that we continue to stay on top of the pandemic because that public health recovery will lead on economic health recovery. And as we move forward over the next couple of weeks, I look forward to your input as we move to a markup on the Invest in America Act. So with that, thanks again for inviting me this morning live from my place here in Everett. I look forward to your questions. Bruce?
Thanks, Rick. And I know your staff tells me you have a hard stop at 11, so I'm going to encourage folks to send me questions in the chat room. And while I'm waiting for those, let me just also recognize Senator Mike Cuff, the president of PNWER from Montana on the Great Northern Corridor. I don't know if you can, if you're still with us, Senator, or Betts, if you can unmute him. If he's got a comment.
Yes, this is Mike Cuff, currently president of PNWER, and disappointed that we're not headed to Big Sky, Montana for our actual regular summit, but I'm delighted that Bruce and everyone has put this together for our webinar content. I've been on it since the beginning. Not very high tech. I struggled to get on board, but I made it before the train pulled out of the station. So thank you all. Thank you for good information. You know, our capital city of Helena. I remember a couple of years ago I was a party whip, and my speaker came over and said, "Where's Joe Blow? He's not in his seat." So I called him up real quick, and he said, "Mike, I'm sitting here." I said, I forgot the time at lunch. I'm sitting here waiting for this coal train to go by. Be there as quick as I can." So I understand the issues of having to wait to cross. Thank you all for addressing it. Great job. And our good vice president from Idaho, thank you very much as well, Senator Wynn. So that's enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We do have a question for Congressman Larson, and perhaps Paul or Andrew or Jim can also address it. The question is the new proposed investment in grade separation, would it include funding for design, and what about quiet zones, which is a popular topic? Rick, obviously in your district, particularly in Bellingham, I know there's a lot of discussion about quiet zones. So let's start with the congressman first, or maybe Andrew, since you're kind of the leader on the bill, and maybe we could ask the congressman about provisions in Representative Fazio's measure for the 2.5.
Well, I'll be very brief. The concept does include eligibility for design, because you got to get those projects in the pipeline. If it's only for construction, that's great. We know there's a pent-up demand. There's a lot of projects that are ready to go, but there's also a need to get those projects in the pipeline and to make sure that the design work is well positioned and suited to ensure the best project advances. So I'll just leave it at that and invite others to comment.
This is Rick Larson. I'll just note that thanks to Andrew, and I'll have my staff as well look into a little more detail on that. I haven't had the opportunity to go through all 4,397 pages or however long this bill is. It's pretty comprehensive. We focused on some of the other aspects of it, but we'll get back to you, Bruce, through PNWER, and you can distribute our answer that way.
Great. Paul, from BNSF's perspective, quiet zones, grade separations, you want to comment on those?
Sure, I could start with the grade separations and say I would agree that design and the need for design funding is a critical part of achieving a successful project, and it's challenging for local communities to come up with the money that's necessary to put those designs together. And while BNSF may be able to contribute some portion to the ultimate construction of the grade separation, depending on the conditions of the deal to be had, it's really hard for us to justify that sort of investment on the front end, not knowing if construction will ever come. And so certainly we would say, yes, there is a need for design funding at the local level.
Great. I wanted to make sure we've got Rick for a few more minutes. Are there any other questions? And while we're waiting for the chat room to perk up here, let me also see if Representative Andrew Barkis is on the line or available. I want to recognize to you, Congressman Larson, you may be aware that there is a Washington State Legislative Rail Caucus, and they do a great job. And I'm sure they briefed you on all the freight and passenger rail needs. Representative Barkis, can you speak? Are you unmuted?
I am. Good morning to everybody, and thank you for Bruce. Thanks for the invite and letting me participate, and for keeping me informed over the last couple of years. So for those of you who don't know me, I represent the 2nd legislative district, not the congressional district, the 2nd legislative district, beautiful Thurston and Pierce County, Washington, been serving in the legislature for the last 5 years. I am also the ranking member on transportation, and so have been working all things transportation, and rail is a passion of mine, has been before I got to the House of Representatives. So nice mesh to bring that love of all things that we do into a working relationship. Thank you, Congressman Larson, for participating, for all your work on the federal level in transportation for the state of Washington. And this is a very important corridor. Shout out to BNSF. I enjoy working with Johan. He is fantastic as a government affairs and has been instrumental in our partnership in working on a lot of legislation affecting rail in our network here in Washington State, which is integral to our commerce and everything else. So just briefly, I will be working with your organization. This is a very important topic. This is a topic that has been something of discussion for quite a while. We see this now with a lot of the conversations going on with capital projects, with economic recovery, with access into our ports, et cetera, wherever we have this nexus between road and rail. And these grade crossings are imperative. They're also imperative to our intercity passenger service. We have the Cascade corridors here. A lot of work, a lot of federal dollars have been invested. Unfortunately, we had the tragedy in DuPont several years ago. I have a follow-up call this week with WSDOT Rail Division, my good friend Ron. We're going to talk about, see where we're at with that bypass and some of the things that have been done to get us rolling there. We cannot forget the great things that we have, and this crisis has been devastating, as Congressman Larson and all of us know, to the impact of revenue, ridership, and we have to work to instill confidence back in the people of the state of Washington to get back on those great forms of transportation that we have, use that corridor that we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in as a phenomenal thing. And the grade crossing situation also impacts our ability to move people quicker between Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon, along that Cascade corridor. And so this is an ongoing conversation that we've been having with BNSF and in the transportation arena. So we're going to continue to work. We do have challenges in revenue, of course, with the impact of COVID, our budget. We've had massive conversations about how we're going to be dealing with this. And I keep going back to prioritization, and we have to keep those priorities high. We have to keep looking at areas where there are areas that we can improve our economic recovery. And these capital projects are part of that, where we create jobs and all the different things along those lines. And we need to bolster our relationship with the congressman and between the federal government and the state of Washington. And I'm glad to hear that there's a potential for some dollars coming to the state of Washington. And then we have to do our best to make sure that those dollars get applied appropriately to do what is necessary to keep the state moving. So thank you, Bruce, for letting me sit on this. I do also have a hard stop at 11 for another meeting, and then another 6 more to go for the day. I'm sure the congressman can relate as we shift into this new reality of looking at our friends. I can't wait to meet y'all in person. I'm looking forward to getting back to the normal things. Devin, thank you for what you're doing. It's a great example of what's going on up in Canada. We did our joint transportation committee tour, went up to Victoria last year. And so we had some great conversations with the Ministry of Transportation about some of the innovative things that you're doing. And I think your example of that corridor for the port in Vancouver is a world example of what can be done when you work together on these things and importance. And it's something we've struggled with here in Washington. You know, we have just so happens that the Puget Sound is a very unique region, and where the water meets the road and the mountains butt up to, it makes for challenges on how we move goods and services and people around. But I think this team is very much up to the challenge of getting that done. So thank you very much.
Bruce, you're muted.
Sorry, I had a gas lawnmower next to me. It's one of the challenges in being at home. I got basically a minute to ask Rick one more question, and that is, how are we going to save the airline industry? That's come up twice.
Great.
Question Q&A.
Thanks for not taking the minute to ask me, so I have 40 seconds to answer. I appreciate Yeah, by the way, thanks for doing this on a GoToMeetings. It gave me a chance to learn a new app, and I learned how to turn my webcam on. Thank you. I'll take more than a minute. My staff will take care of my 11 o'clock till I get on it, but because I don't want to rush this. The first thing we need to do, and we did in the CARES Act, was use the airlines as a pass-through mechanism for the employees that work at the airlines. So through September 30th, airlines who did apply, and most of the large ones did, including Alaska Airlines, applied for what we call PSP. It's basically money that's gone through the airlines that are using to pay salaries and benefits for their employees. Think pilots, so flight crew, cabin crew, ticket agents, customer service folks, anyone who's wearing that uniform of the airlines. It also exists for contractors working at the airports as well. So that was first. The second thing that we've done is for some of the supply chain, the repair, maintenance, and so on. Think of ATS in Everett, Washington, that does repairs, and there are a lot of companies that do this. There's a separate mechanism to help them, including the Payment Protection Program, which is the SBA program that folks could apply for. But that applied broadly to all businesses, but they're certainly applied to aviation businesses, especially smaller ones. Think of a San Juan Airlines in Bellingham, Washington, as a smaller airline that could be eligible, that was eligible for PPP as well. Then you really get into the supply chain, which is the number one supply of an airline is an airplane, and that's where you get to Boeing and the Boeing supply chain as well. So for instance, I have Safran, 4 of the 5 facilities at Safran, which is a French company, but 4 of their 5 Washington State facilities are in my district. So think of the making of interiors, think of making seats, thinking of making the galley or even the bathrooms. You have companies that do that. They're the supply chain, and they're laying off people too. Because if an airline doesn't need to buy airplanes, then airplane makers don't need to build them, nor do they need the supplies to make those airplanes. And so that's the situation that we're in. So fundamentally, it comes down to a broader economic recovery so that the demand for the airplane increases because there is more travel in the United States. So we're doing a lot of things to try to stabilize. This will sound a little backwards, but try to get to the bottom of this as fast as possible so that we can get to the recovery as fast as possible. And stabilizing the aviation market is important, and we're doing that through these mechanisms to get it stabilized so that then we can get into the recovery part. The recovery part is much more complex. If there's not a place to fly to, there's no reason to fly. So if Disneyland and Disney World don't open up, that I don't need to fly to Anaheim or Orlando to go there. And that's just a tourism example. So that's just one part of that recovery. Another part is the confidence inside the cabin that people have. So we don't have any requirements or mandates, but most of the airlines are passing out masks. They're passing out wipes. They're doing their best to not book middle seats, but a middle seat, whether you're sitting a foot away from somebody or 3 feet away from somebody in an airplane, you're still not 6 feet away from somebody. And so the idea of middle seat block offs is interesting, but at some point, as more people fly, airlines are going to have to put people in middle seats because you need to have a revenue generating model. It may not, right now airlines aren't even proposing to have profit generating models. They're more focused on revenue generating models, so they're losing less money so they can survive later. And that's kind of the position that they're in. That's the bad news, but it's generally accepted bad news throughout the entire industry, and the entire industry is planning for that, including the airplane makers. So that's why you see layoffs at Boeing and the supply chain. And we're doing our best to support those workers who are being laid off involuntarily. But we're not going to be. Let me give you an example. Two examples, and I'll end to give you a flavor. That again, I'm not trying to say this is bad news. I'm just trying to say this is the reality that we're in right now. Memorial Day this year, a couple weeks ago, there were about 349,000 air travelers domestically. That compares to somewhere below 100,000 at the low point of the pandemic. Okay, so it's a big increase. It is still an 88% decrease compared to Memorial Day 2019. So even though we've seen a 260,000 increase within the pandemic time period of domestic travel, it's still an 88% decrease. Another way to think about that is Boeing had planned, rumored to plan to go to 52 737 MAXs per month in production. They're now looking at 31 per month starting probably next year. They're going to be somewhat at some number. They've restarted. They'll be at some number, but their target is 31 compared to 52 what it was. So that gives you a flavor of where the industry is now. That's the market. That's the reality. And again, public health will lead on the economic health recovery, and there's just no way around that. And so, sorry, Bruce, maybe you're expecting a shorter, more positive view, but I'd rather provide the realistic view, because we have the realistic view, then we can actually move forward from that. And I feel better about moving forward from a realistic point of view than trying to, put lipstick on a pig here.
Thank you, Rick, and thanks for going overtime with us.
Yeah, no problem. I'll sign off though. I got to go.
And thanks for actually going back to Washington D.C. and voting. We appreciate that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Okay, we're overtime, and we're at overtime here, and I'm trying to outshout a gas blower next door. So I do, before we sign off, want to thank our panelists. I also wanted to thank the leadership of all aboard Washington, our Washington State's passenger rail advocacy, Luis Moscoso, and the board do a great job in supporting passenger rail, which PNWER supports, as well as grade separation. Thank you, panelists. This has been wonderful. I didn't think we could do it in an hour, but we had a nice kind of segue to get an update on the air travel, which affects everybody, and certainly our economy. We hope Rick and Congress and administration can really pull us out of this really messy situation. So that's it for PNWER, and we will have, this is recorded by TVW, and we will be, had several questions. We will be sending out the PowerPoints and the link to the TVW broadcast from Betts at PNWER, and we'll go from there. So before I get completely drowned out by my neighborhood noises, now I got a car honking. Thanks to everybody, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Bruce.